Night at negative 73 degrees Celsius, deep in the heart of Appalachia. A grandmother and her grandson alone, buried under 7 feet of snow, with no power, no phone signal, and no one coming. That was the night Micah Suttles learned what it truly meant to fight for someone, not with strength, not with money, but with nothing more than his own 2 hands, a dying fire, and a promise he made to a woman who had given him everything. But before that night, before the cold tried to take everything from them, there was a morning that started like any other in Harlan County, Kentucky. Eleanor Suttles was 71 years old. She had lived in that cabin on Pigeon Ridge for 46 of those years, ever since her husband Roy built it with timber he cut himself from the hillside behind the property. Roy had been dead for 9 years now, taken by a stroke one January morning while he was splitting wood. Eleanor found him in the snow, axe still in his hand, eyes open to the sky. She never moved from that mountain. She said the cabin still smelled like him if she kept the windows closed long enough. Her grandson, Micah, was 21. He was the son of Eleanor's youngest daughter, Jolene, who had moved to Lexington years earlier to work at a distribution warehouse. Jolene was a hard worker, but the hours were brutal and the pay barely covered rent. Micah had grown up splitting his time between his mother's apartment in the city and his grandmother's cabin on the ridge. He had learned to walk on that porch. He had learned to fish in the creek behind the house. He had learned to split wood at 12, fix a leaking roof at 15, and change the brake pads on his grandmother's old truck at 17. Eleanor had raised him as much as Jolene had, maybe more, and they both knew it even if neither of them said it out loud. Micah was studying welding at the community college in Hazard. He was good with his hands, the same way Roy had been, and Eleanor told him that every chance she got. He had his grandfather's build, too, broad shoulders and thick forearms, and the same quiet way of moving through the world, like he was always listening to something no one else could hear. He had come up the mountain for winter break, because that was what he always did. Every December, every summer, every chance he got, Micah went back to Pigeon Ridge. The city never felt like home to him. The mountain did. That December, he arrived on a Tuesday in his beat-up Dodge pickup, the one he had bought with welding money and fixed up himself in the parking lot of his apartment complex. He brought groceries, a new battery for Eleanor's radio, and a space heater he had found on sale at the hardware store in Hazard, just in case the wood stove was not enough. Eleanor had laughed at the space heater. She said she had survived 71 winters without one, and she did not intend to start relying on one now. But she let him plug it in anyway because it made him feel better, and making Micah feel useful was something she had always been good at. The weather forecast that week called for light snow, maybe 2 to 4 inches. Nothing unusual for Harlan County in December. The mountains always got snow. Eleanor had seen blizzards before. She had survived the ice storm of 1998, when the power was out for 11 days and she melted snow on the wood stove just to have water. Micah remembered that storm too, vaguely, the way you remember things from early childhood, more feeling than detail. He remembered being warm. He remembered Eleanor's arms around him. He remembered not being afraid. But what came on Thursday night was not a blizzard. It was something else entirely. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron. Micah noticed it first. He had been out on the porch stacking the firewood he had split that morning, and when he straightened up and looked west, something in his gut tightened. The wind had changed direction. It was coming from the northwest now, hard and dry, the kind of wind that cuts through denim and Carhartt canvas like they are made of paper. He checked the thermometer nailed to the porch post. It read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That was cold for early evening, even up here. He brought in 3 extra armloads of wood and latched the door. Eleanor was in the kitchen making soup, beans, and cornbread, the same meal she had made every Thursday night for as long as Micah had been alive. The cabin smelled like onions and cast iron and wood smoke, and for a moment, standing there in the doorway with the cold at his back and the warmth on his face, Micah felt the same thing he always felt when he came home to this place. Safe. "Grammy, that sky doesn't look right," he said, pulling off his gloves and hanging them on the nail by the door. Eleanor glanced out the window. The first flakes were already falling, thick and fast, not the lazy drifting kind, but the kind that fell with purpose, with weight. "Might get a good bit," she said, stirring the beans. Nothing we can't handle. She was wrong. By 9 o'clock that night, there were already 8 inches on the ground. By midnight, it was over a foot. The wind was screaming now. Not howling, screaming, a sustained roar that rattled the windows in their frames and pushed the cold through every crack and gap in the cabin walls. Micah got up twice to stuff rags into the spaces around the door. The wood stove was burning hot, but he could feel the temperature in the room dropping. The thermometer on the porch was no longer visible. It was buried. He turned on the battery-powered radio, the one with the new battery he had brought. The signal was weak, fading in and out, but he caught enough to understand what was happening. A polar vortex had collapsed, sending a mass of Arctic air farther south than anyone had predicted. Temperatures across the central Appalachian region were expected to drop to levels not seen in recorded history. Wind chill warnings were in effect for the entire state of Kentucky. The National Weather Service was using words like historic, unprecedented, and life-threatening. Micah sat at the kitchen table and listened. Eleanor was in her rocking chair by the stove, wrapped in a quilt her mother had sewn by hand in 1957. She was watching him the way she always watched him when something was wrong, not with panic, but with patience, waiting for him to process, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be in this moment. He met her eyes across the room. "Grammy, this is bad." She nodded. "I know it is. We might be stuck up here for a while. I know that too." He looked at the wood stacked along the wall, then at the stove, then back at her. He did the math in his head. He had always been good at math, the practical kind, the kind that tells you how many hours of heat you have left and how many you need. It was not enough. When Micah opened his eyes Friday morning, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The wind had stopped. For a moment, he thought the storm had passed. Then he tried to open the front door. It would not move. He put his shoulder into it, all 210 pounds of him, and the door did not budge. He went to the window and scraped the frost from the glass with his thumbnail. The snow was up to the bottom of the window frame, and the window was 4 feet off the ground. He moved to the back door. Same thing, snow packed solid against it. He could not get out. They were sealed in. His cell phone was useless. No signal on Pigeon Ridge, never had been. The nearest neighbor was Carl Bratcher, who lived 2 miles down the hollow, but Carl was 83 and had gone to stay with his daughter in Knoxville for the holidays. There was no one else. The road up to the ridge was a single-lane gravel path that the county did not plow. Even in normal winters, it was often impassable for days after a storm. This was not a normal winter. Micah checked the thermometer through the kitchen window, pressing his face against the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes. He could just barely make out the red line through the frost. He stared at it for a long time, then stepped back. The thermometer read -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. Eleanor was watching him from her chair. She had not moved. She had not asked. She was waiting. "Grammy," he said, and his voice was steady even though his hands were not. "We're going to be okay. I'm going to figure this out." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, the smallest smile, the kind that lives only in the corners of the mouth, and she said, "I know you will. You're Roy's boy." That was the moment Micah Suttles stopped being a kid who came to his grandmother's cabin for winter break. That was the moment he became the man who was going to keep her alive. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one will test everything you think you know about survival, about love, and about what a person is willing to sacrifice when the life of someone they love is on the line. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. You do not want to miss what happens next. Micah did an inventory. He was methodical about it, the way his welding instructor had taught him to be methodical about everything. Measure twice. Plan before you act. Know your materials. He had enough firewood stacked inside the cabin to last maybe 4 days if he burned it conservatively. Outside, under the lean-to beside the cabin, there was another cord and a half, but that was buried under feet of snow and ice and he could not get to it. He had 2 5-gallon jugs of water, a bag of flour, a tin of lard, a dozen eggs, a sack of dried pinto beans, half a bag of cornmeal, some canned peaches, a jar of peanut butter, and 6 cans of soup. He had candles, matches, 2 flashlights, a first aid kit, and a bottle of Eleanor's blood pressure medication. He had the space heater, but the power had gone out sometime during the night, so it was useless. He had blankets and quilts, enough to bury them both. What he did not have was a way out, a way to call for help, or any certainty that anyone would come looking for them before the food and wood ran out. He sat down across from Eleanor and told her the numbers straight. He did not soften it. She would have been insulted if he had. Eleanor Suttles had survived things that would have broken most people, and she had done it by facing the truth head-on, not by hiding from it. 4 days of wood, he said. Maybe 5 if I cut the burn rate. Food for a week if we stretch it. Water's not a problem as long as I can melt snow on the stove. The real issue is the wood. Eleanor nodded. Your grandfather always said a man can solve any problem if he breaks it down small enough. I'm not sure Grandpa Roy ever faced -70 wind chill. No, she said, but he faced plenty of things that should have killed him, and he's still the reason this cabin is standing. The walls are double thick. He overbuilt everything because he said the mountain would test it eventually. I think this is the test he was talking about. Micah looked at the walls. Solid timber, double-layered with insulation packed between them. Roy Suttles had built this cabin the way he did everything, with more care and strength than anyone thought was necessary. And now, 46 years later, that care and strength was the only thing standing between his wife and his grandson and the cold that was trying to kill them. By nightfall, the temperature outside had fallen to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had returned worse than before. Micah could hear the cabin groaning, the old timbers contracting in the cold, popping and cracking like bones. He fed the stove every hour, keeping the fire as hot as he dared without risking a chimney fire. The temperature inside the cabin hovered around 45 degrees near the stove, but in the corners of the room, near the windows, it was barely above freezing. Frost was forming on the inside of the glass, thick and white, spreading across the panes like something alive. He moved Eleanor's rocking chair closer to the stove. He hung blankets over the windows for insulation. He sealed the gaps around the doors with every piece of fabric he could find. He reduced their living space to just the area around the wood stove, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. Everything else was sacrificed to the cold. Eleanor watched him work without saying a word. She knew what he was doing. She had done the same thing herself, years ago, during storms that were bad, but nothing like this. She recognized the focus in his eyes, the way his jaw was set, the way he moved from task to task without pausing, without wasting a single motion. It was Roy. It was exactly Roy. The same hands, the same determination, the same refusal to sit still when something needed doing. You need to eat, she said. I'll eat later. Micah. He stopped. He looked at her. She was sitting in her chair with the quilt pulled up to her chin and her white hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked smaller than he had ever seen her. Smaller and older and more fragile, and it hit him then. Really hit him. That this woman who had been the strongest person in his world for his entire life was 71 years old and she was cold and she was scared even though she would never say it. He sat down. He ate a bowl of soup. He made her eat one too. Grammy, he said, I need you to promise me something. What's that?
I promise.
Promise me you'll tell me if something doesn't feel right. Your chest, your hands, your feet, anything. Don't tough it out. Don't pretend. I need to know. She looked at him for a long time. When did you grow up? Somewhere between splitting your firewood and changing your brake pads. She almost laughed. Almost. I promise, she said. By Saturday, the wood was going faster than Micah had calculated. The cold was more intense than anything the cabin had ever been designed to handle, and the stove was eating through logs at nearly double the normal rate. He recounted. 3 days of wood left, maybe 2.5. He made a decision. He went to the back bedroom, the room Eleanor had shared with Roy for 37 years. The bed was made of solid oak, built by Roy's father in 1942. It was the bed Eleanor had slept in every night of her married life. It was the bed where she had held Roy's hand the night before he died. Micah knew the history of that bed the way he knew the history of every piece of furniture in this cabin, because Eleanor had told him, story by story, memory by memory, over the course of 21 years. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the bed and he felt something break inside him, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way a branch breaks under snow, slowly, and then all at once. He started pulling it apart. Eleanor appeared behind him. She did not speak. She watched him remove the headboard, then the side rails, then the slats. He carried them to the main room and stacked them by the stove. "Micah, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do, Grammy. That was your grandfather's bed." He turned to face her, and his eyes were wet, but his voice was not. "Grandpa Roy built this cabin to keep you safe. He built that bed to give you rest. And if he were standing here right now, he would take that bed apart with his own hands and put it in that fire himself. Because keeping you alive matters more than keeping anything else. You know that. You know him. Tell me I'm wrong." Eleanor said nothing, because he was not wrong. He was exactly right. And she knew it because she knew Roy and she knew Micah. And in that moment, they were the same person, separated by death and decades, but joined by something that the cold could not touch. The oak burned hot and slow, buying them precious hours. When the bed was gone, Micah started on the dresser, then the nightstand, then the bookshelf in the hallway. He did it methodically, without emotion on his face, saving the emotion for later, for a time when emotion would not cost them heat. On Saturday night, the radio delivered the number that neither of them would ever forget. The announcer's voice was grim, almost disbelieving. Wind chill across the highest elevations of eastern Kentucky had reached -73°C, -100°F, the coldest temperature ever recorded in the region, colder than the surface of Mars on a mild day, colder than any place any human being was meant to survive. Micah turned off the radio. He checked the stove. He had burned through the bed, the dresser, and half the bookshelf. He had maybe 2 days of fuel left, counting the kitchen chairs and the remaining shelves. After that, he would have to start on the walls. And if he started on the walls, the cold would come in even faster. He thought about his mother in Lexington. He thought about whether Jolene knew what was happening up here. He thought about the fact that no one was coming, that no one could come, that the road was buried and the phones were dead and they were as alone as two people could possibly be on this earth. Eleanor was sitting in her rocker with her eyes closed. Her breathing was shallow. Her lips had a bluish tint that Micah did not like. He knelt beside her and took her hands. They were ice cold. "Grammy, hey, look at me." She opened her eyes. They were clear, sharp, the same eyes that had watched him take his first steps, that had checked his homework, that had told him he was worth something on the days when the world tried to tell him he was not. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "No, you're not," he said, "because I won't let you." He wrapped every blanket they had around her. He pulled her chair so close to the stove that the heat was almost painful. He sat on the floor beside her with his back against the chair and his hand on her arm so he could feel her pulse, so he would know, every second, that she was still there. And he stayed like that all night. He did not sleep. He fed the fire. He listened to her breathe. And every time her breathing slowed or changed, he talked to her, told her stories, the same stories she had told him when he was small, about Roy and the mines and the old days, about the creek and the crawdads and the sorghum candy, about the mountain and the people who lived on it and refused to leave. He talked to keep her awake. He talked to keep her alive. He talked because silence, in that cold, was the sound of giving up. And Micah Suttles did not give up. Not on this mountain. Not on this woman. Not ever. Sunday morning came gray and silent. The wind had dropped again, but the cold had not. Micah could feel it in his hands, in his feet, in the ache behind his eyes that came from 36 hours without sleep. He was burning the kitchen chairs now. 2 left. After that, the table. After the table, he would start on the shelves in the pantry. After that, there was nothing left but the walls themselves. Eleanor had made it through the night, but she was weaker. Her blood pressure medication had run out the day before. She had only brought enough for the original length of the visit. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper, something Micah recognized because he had read about it when she was first diagnosed. Without the medication, her blood pressure would climb. In these conditions, with the stress and the cold and the dehydration, that climb could become dangerous. He made her drink warm water. He made her eat half a can of peaches. He kept talking to her, kept her engaged, kept her mind working, because a mind that was working was a mind that was fighting. "Tell me about the day you met Grandpa Roy," he said. She smiled, and the smile took 10 years off her face. "You've heard that story 100 times. Tell me again." So she told him. She told him about the church social in 1971, about the skinny boy with the big hands who asked her to dance and stepped on her feet 3 times and apologized each time like he had committed a crime. She told him about their first date, which was a walk along the river because Roy did not have money for anything else. She told him about the day Roy proposed, kneeling in the mud beside the creek because he had planned to do it on the ridge at sunset, but it rained and he could not wait any longer. She told him about the wedding, 12 people in a living room, her mother crying, Roy's father playing fiddle, and how Roy whispered in her ear during their first dance that he was going to build her a house on the highest ridge he could find so she could see the whole world from her kitchen window. And he did. He built this cabin, and she could see the whole world from here, or at least the only part of the world that ever mattered to her. Micah listened, and the stories kept them both warm in a way the fire could not. 200 miles west, in Lexington, Jolene Suttles was pacing the floor of her apartment, phone in hand, terror in her chest. She had been trying to call her mother for 2 days. No answer, no signal. She had tried calling Micah. Same thing. She had called the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, and they had told her the same thing 3 times. All roads into the eastern mountain communities were closed. They had rescue teams working around the clock, but the conditions were unprecedented. They were prioritizing areas with confirmed emergencies. There was no confirmed emergency on Pigeon Ridge because there was no way to confirm anything on Pigeon Ridge. Jolene had not slept in 36 hours. She had called the Red Cross, the National Guard hotline, the local news stations. Everyone said the same thing. The storm was too severe. Access was impossible. They were doing everything they could. But Jolene was Eleanor's daughter, and Eleanor's daughter did not sit and wait. She drove to her friend Marcus's house. Marcus worked for a telecommunications company and had access to equipment that most people did not. She asked him for a satellite phone. He gave her one without hesitation, fully charged, and told her to be careful. Then she got in her car, put chains on the tires, and drove east toward the mountains, into the storm that everyone else was running from. She drove because her mother was up there. She drove because her son was up there. She drove because the women in the Suttles family had been walking into impossible situations and refusing to die for 200 years. And Jolene was not about to be the one who broke that chain. Back on the mountain, Micah was burning the kitchen table. He had sawed the legs off with a handsaw, his arms shaking from exhaustion, and fed them into the stove one at a time. The cabin was stripped now. Bare walls, empty rooms. The only furniture left was Eleanor's rocking chair and the stove itself. Everything else was ash. Eleanor was quiet. Too quiet. Micah checked her pulse. It was fast and thready. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her breathing was shallow. He recognized the signs. Hypothermia was setting in despite everything he had done, despite the fire, despite the blankets, despite the hours of talking and warmth and will. He did the only thing he had left. He sat in the rocking chair and he pulled her into his lap the way she used to pull him into hers when he was small, and he wrapped every blanket around them both, and he held her against his chest so his body heat would reach her, and he rocked slowly, back and forth, the way she used to rock him to sleep 20 years ago in this same chair. "Grammy," he said softly, "you remember what Grandpa Roy used to say about the mountains?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "The mountains don't break the people who live on them." "That's right. And what else?" "The mountains make them." "The mountains make them," Micah repeated. "And they made you. And you made me. And I am not letting this mountain take you. Not tonight. Not ever. She closed her eyes and leaned into him, and her hand found his, and she held on, and he could feel her grip, weak but there, weak but refusing to let go. If this story is making you feel something right now, take a moment and leave a comment. Type this exact phrase, "The mountains make them." Drop it below. Do it now. Eleanor and Micah need to know you are here. Jolene Suttles reached the base of Pigeon Ridge Road at 6 in the morning on Monday. She had been driving for 15 hours. The highway had been open as far as Harlan, but past that the roads were walls of white. The road up the ridge was completely buried, not plowed, not tracked. Nothing but snow stretching up into the gray forever of the mountain. She could not drive any farther. The road was gone. She sat in her car for exactly 60 seconds. She looked at the satellite phone on the passenger seat. She could call for help. She could call 911 and give them the coordinates and wait in the car for a rescue team that might take hours or days to arrive. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing. Jolene picked up the phone, made the call, gave the dispatcher the location and the situation, and then she got out of the car and started walking up the mountain. It was 2 miles to the cabin, 2 miles through snow that was waist-deep in places and chest-deep in others. The cold hit her like nothing she had ever felt. It was not weather, it was violence. It burned her skin and stole her breath and tried to push her back down the mountain with every step. Her gloves were soaked through within 30 minutes. She could not feel her fingers. She could not feel her feet. She kept going. She fell. She got up. She fell again. She crawled on her hands and knees when the snow was too deep to walk through. She screamed her mother's name into the wind, knowing the wind would swallow it, screaming anyway because screaming meant she was still alive and still moving and still fighting. Because her mother had taught her that. Her mother had taught her everything. And the most important thing Eleanor Suttles ever taught her daughter was this: you do not stop, not for cold, not for pain, not for fear. You do not stop until the people you love are safe. Micah heard it first, a sound that did not belong to the wind or the cold or the creaking of the cabin. A voice, distant but real, calling a name he knew. He eased Eleanor off his lap and onto the blankets by the stove. His legs were numb. He had not stood in hours. He grabbed the edge of the stove and pulled himself up, pain shooting through his knees and ankles, and he shuffled to the window and scraped at the frost. And there, 50 yards from the cabin, struggling through the snow with her arms pumping and her face raw and red, was his mother. Micah's chest cracked open, not his ribs, something deeper. Something that had been holding everything together for 4 days, all the fear, all the responsibility, all the weight of keeping another person alive when the world was trying to kill them both, and it all came loose at once, and he pressed his forehead against the frozen glass and he cried. Then he wiped his face and went to work. He could not open the doors. The snow was packed solid. He shouted through the wall, told Jolene to dig at the back door where the drift was thinnest. He could hear her digging, scraping, clawing at the snow and ice. It took nearly an hour. When the door finally gave, when it swung inward and the blinding white light and the brutal cold poured into the cabin, Jolene fell through the doorway and collapsed on the floor, shaking violently, her lips blue, her fingers cracked and bleeding. Micah pulled her inside and slammed the door shut. He wrapped her in blankets. He held her hands between his and breathed on them. She was looking past him, looking at the stove, at the bare walls, at the empty cabin that had once been full of furniture and memories and 46 years of living. "Micah," she whispered, "where is everything?" He looked at the stove. The fire was still burning, fed by the last of the bookshelf. "In there," he said. "All of it." Jolene's eyes filled with tears. Not for the furniture, for what it meant, for what her son had done. For the fact that a 21-year-old boy had dismantled his grandmother's entire life, piece by piece, memory by memory, and burned it all to keep one old woman alive. Then she heard Eleanor's voice from the blankets by the stove, thin but clear, unmistakably Eleanor. "Jolene Marie Suttles, if you are crying over furniture, I raised you wrong." Jolene laughed. It came out broken and wet and halfway to a sob, but it was a laugh, And in that stripped bare cabin, in that impossible cold, it was the warmest sound any of them had ever heard. If this story has touched your heart, hit that like button right now and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one remind us what it means to fight for the people we love. Share it, spread it. Let someone else feel what you are feeling right now. Jolene had brought the satellite phone. That phone saved their lives. The call she had made from the base of the mountain had already set the rescue in motion, but the rescue team needed time. They came on snowmobiles, 4 members of the Harlan County Search and Rescue Team, dragging a sled equipped with heating blankets and medical supplies. They reached the cabin just after midnight, 18 hours after Jolene had started walking up the ridge. The rescue team leader, a man named Dennis Caldwell who had been doing mountain rescue for 22 years, said later that when he walked into that cabin and saw what had been done, saw the walls bare and every piece of furniture gone, and a 21-year-old kid sitting on the floor holding his grandmother in his arms next to a stove fed with the last scraps of an oak bed frame built in 1942, he had to step outside for a moment to collect himself. He said he had seen a lot of things on that mountain over the years, but he had never seen anything like that. They stabilized Eleanor first. Her core temperature had dropped to 91 degrees, dangerously low. They wrapped her in heating blankets and started a warm IV. Micah refused to leave her side. He held her hand while they worked, and when they asked him to step back, he said, with a politeness that was pure Appalachian, "Sir, with all due respect, I have not let go of this woman in 4 days, and I am not about to start now." They let him stay. They loaded Eleanor onto the sled and strapped Micah and Jolene onto the backs of snowmobiles, and they made the 2-mile trip down the mountain in the dark, in the cold, with the stars overhead for the first time in days, because the storm had finally broken. Eleanor spent 5 days in the hospital. Severe hypothermia, frostbite on both hands. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously without her medication, and the doctors said she had come closer than any of them wanted to say out loud, to a cardiac event. They said if she had gone another 12 hours without medical attention, the outcome would have been very different. Micah was treated for exhaustion, mild frostbite on his feet, and dehydration. He had lost 11 pounds in 4 days. The nurses said he slept for 22 hours straight once they put him in a bed, but before he closed his eyes, he made them promise that his bed would be in the same room as Eleanor's. They moved him. He reached across the gap between the beds and held his grandmother's hand. And that was how they slept, connected, the way they had been since the moment the storm hit. Jolene was treated for frostbite on her hands and feet from the climb up the mountain. The doctor who examined her said it was a miracle she had not lost fingers. Jolene said it was not a miracle. She said it was stubbornness and that she came by it honestly. She sat in a chair between her mother's bed and her son's bed, and she did not leave, and she did not sleep, and she watched them hold hands across the gap, and she understood something that she had been too busy, too tired, too caught up in the machinery of survival to understand before. She had spent years leaving Micah with Eleanor because she thought she was being practical, because someone had to earn the money, because the hours were brutal and the rent was high and there was no other way. And all of that was true. But it was also true that the 2 most important people in her life had almost died on a mountain while she was 200 miles away, and that the only reason they were alive was because a 21-year-old boy had the strength and the love and the stubbornness to burn a lifetime of memories to keep one old woman warm. She was done being 200 miles away. They went back to the cabin in January, all 3 of them, when the roads were finally clear. The cabin was standing, but damaged. The roof had buckled under the weight of the snow, and the inside was the gutted shell that Micah had made it. Walls bare, floors empty, the stove cold and dead in the center of the room. Micah walked through the room slowly. He touched the walls his grandfather had built. He stood in the doorway of the back bedroom where the oak bed had been, the bed he had taken apart with his own hands and fed to the fire piece by piece. He could still smell the smoke. He could still feel the weight of the headboard in his arms. He knelt down on the floor and found a small piece of oak that had fallen behind where the bed frame used to stand. It was no bigger than his palm, smooth and worn from years of hands gripping it, decades of his grandfather pulling himself up in the morning, decades of his grandmother reaching out in the dark. He put it in his pocket. Eleanor was standing in the main room, looking at the place where her rocking chair had been. The only piece of furniture Micah had not burned because she was sitting in it, and he would have burned the walls before he burned the chair that held her. The rescue team had left it behind. It was still there, standing alone in the empty room, the only thing left. "Micah," she said, and her voice was steady and strong in a way it had not been in weeks. "I want you to take that chair. Grammy, take it. Put it in your apartment. Sit in it when you study. Sit in it when you're tired. And when you have children of your own someday, rock them in it. The way I rocked you. The way I rocked your mother. The way your grandfather rocked me the night he told me he was going to build this house." Micah lifted the chair. It was heavier than he expected, solid and real, built to last the way everything Roy Suttles built was built to last. He carried it out of the cabin and put it in the bed of his truck. Then they left. Eleanor moved to Lexington that spring. Jolene found a bigger apartment, a 2-bedroom with a kitchen window that faced east, toward the mountains. Eleanor took the second bedroom. Micah kept his apartment near the college but came over every Sunday for dinner. He always sat in the rocking chair. Jolene quit the warehouse job. She found work at a medical clinic closer to home, fewer hours, less money, but she was there. She was present. She was done sacrificing presence for practicality. The cabin on Pigeon Ridge was condemned by the county that April and torn down in June. The land sat empty for a year before a conservation group purchased it and incorporated it into a nature preserve. The creek still runs behind where the house used to be. The old cemetery is still there, 5 generations of Suttles' names carved into stone that the weather is slowly wearing smooth. Micah finished his welding certification that May. He graduated at the top of his class. Eleanor was in the front row, clapping harder than anyone, wearing the same dress she had worn to every important event in her family's life for the past 20 years. When they asked Micah to say a few words, he stood at the podium, and he looked at his grandmother, and he said only this: "Everything I am, I owe to a woman who taught me that love is not a feeling. Love is a verb. Love is what you do when the fire is dying, and the cold is coming, and there is nothing left to burn. Love is holding on, and I will hold on for the rest of my life." Eleanor did not cry. She never cried, but her hands were shaking, and she was smiling, and the piece of oak from Roy's headboard was in her pocket, and the mountains were behind her, and her family was in front of her, and that was enough. That was everything. The rocking chair sits in Micah Suttles' apartment in Hazard, Kentucky, next to the window where the morning light comes in. It is the only piece of the cabin on Pigeon Ridge that survived the coldest night in Appalachian history. Sometimes on winter evenings, when the temperature drops and the wind picks up, Micah sits in that chair and he closes his eyes and he listens, and if he listens carefully enough, he can hear it. The creak of old timber, the pop of oak burning slow and hot, the sound of his grandmother's voice telling him to hold on. And he does. He always does. Because the mountains don't break the people who live on them. The mountains make them. If you watched all the way to the end, it is because this story stayed with you the way Micah's arms stayed around Eleanor on the coldest night of their lives. Se você assistiu até aqui é porque gostou desse caso. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are, so I can know who truly connects with the stories on this channel. Check if you are already subscribed, because stories about real courage, real sacrifice, and real love are what this channel is built on, and if you subscribe, you will never miss another one. Hit that like button if Micah's strength and Eleanor's spirit moved you. And share this video, share it right now, with someone who needs to be reminded that love is not a word. Love is what you do when there is nothing left and you refuse to let go. Someone out there needs this story as much as you did. Send it to them.